Everybody, welcome to the Bard Graduate Center and this second lecture of the year in our series Indigenous Arts in Transition. I'm Aaron Glass, a professor of anthropology here and the convener of this series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape people on whose ancestral territories we're gathered here tonight. For those joining us online from other ancestral territories, on BGC TV, feel free to tweet in some questions after the talk at hashtag BardGradCenterTV, which should be listed on your live stream screen. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Howard Morphine, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at Australian National University, Honorary Curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and current scholar in residence at the Getty, where I look forward to joining him in a couple of months. Building on anthropology degrees from University College London and Australian National University, and as the recipient of numerous prestigious grants, fellowships, and awards, Morphy has become one of the leading anthropologists of art and material culture of his generation. While his work is grounded in close and long-term ethnographic study of specific communities, especially among Aboriginal Yolngu people in Northern Australia, his research, teaching, and writing expand to encompass global Indigenous arts, especially in the contexts of historical transformations, cross-cultural encounters, and museum collection. Morphy's most influential publications run this gamut. His 1991 book, Ancestral Connections, Art and an Aboriginal System of Knowledge, not only performs a detailed ethnoaesthetics of Yolngu art, but also situates artistic practice within realms of language, genealogy, ceremony, politics, and epistemology. In a 2007 follow-up, a kind of sequel of sorts, entitled Becoming Art, Exploring Cross-Cultural Categories, Morphy traced the processes, local and global, Aboriginal and settler, ceremonial and institutional, by which Yolngu art came to be known by the terms of an international art world. And I think tonight we'll hear about a particularly local episode from this story. And there's other publications of his on display in our second floor library reading room. Along the way, among scores of publications, he's also written a general survey entitled Aboriginal Art, co-authored an exhibition catalog for the British Museum's major 2015 exhibit, Indigenous Australia, Enduring Civilizations, which is upstairs, and co-edited The Anthropology of Art, a reader, which one colleague blurbed as an excellent, near-perfect book that demonstrates the centrality of the anthropology of art in both anthropology and art history debates. This anthropological jack-of-all-trades has curated exhibitions, directed and consulted on ethnographic films, co-produced CD-ROMs and websites, just contributed to land claims, and coordinated digital media projects that aim to reconnect museum collections and ethnographic archives with contemporary Aboriginal communities. His talk tonight is entitled From the Antipodes to the Met, Transformative Processes in Yolngu Art. Please join me in welcoming Howard Morphine.
Okay, well, I'm going to begin with a little bit of talking, and then I'm going to do talking to some images. And I'm going to start with a kind of very, very, very brief theoretical summary of some of the issues that are in my book, Becoming Art. So my overall theme is the journey for recognition of Aboriginal art by gaining a place in those cathedrals of fine art, the Metropolitan Western Art Museums. And I'm not going to leave that image up for long, because we'll come back to it at the end. But this is a recent acquisition of the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Goinbi Gunumba, a Yolngu artist. But we can forget about this for a little while and instead look at what the view is from Francis Morphy, who's also here, and my tent on a sand dune overlooking Blue Mud Bay, where we spent many happy, very hard-working weeks researching Yolngu claims for the rights in the intertidal zone that we're just looking across there. But I thought it was nicer than showing a blank slide at this particular moment in time. Now, I'll argue that the process of the recognition of Australian Aboriginal art has been a cumulative one, with many moments of recognition and many moments of rejection. I'm aware that including Yolngu works in an art museum is recognising them as a particular kind of object, which to an extent has its origins in the cultural history of the West. However, I don't see the institutions in themselves as hegemonic, but as ever-changing in response to the complexities of the worlds of which they are a part. I see the inclusion of non-Western art in the art museums as an index of the transformation of the art museum and also the changing nature of the Western category of art. Although my theoretical position will be largely implicit in this lecture, I'll foreground one current theme: whether works of art should be exhibited in an art museum or an ethnographic museum. Now, the history of ethnographic museums and art museums is associated with two fundamentally different, but at times complementary, value creation processes. The ethnographic museum, through its links with anthropology and the ideology of cultural relativism, introduces people to the diversity of world cultures. The Fine Art Museum, linked to art history, draws people's attention to art as an important dimension of human creativity. In their origins in the 18th and 19th century, the disciplines of art history and anthropology were very much in dialogue with each other. They talked together. And in many respects, both are associated with overlapping value creation processes. But in recent years, the institutions and the disciplines have sometimes been set up in opposition. Ironically, I'll argue that because both have in some respects that in recently both have in some respects come closer together. Australian anthropologists of art and art historians would both claim that Aboriginal art, as part of their subject matter, is an integral part of art practice in Australia. And I think there's ways in which the inclusion of Indigenous art in the context of the art gallery has actually brought anthropology and art history into current discourse. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons that Aaron and I will both be at the Getty at the same time as scholars in a couple of months' time. However, the labels ethnographic and anthropological have been seen to be somewhat problematic in relation to the exhibition of art. Exhibiting them as ethnography rather than art is a bad thing. Exhibiting them in ethnographic museums holds them back. In creating value in artworks, we need to move them from the museum to the art gallery. So these are kind of things that people will say all the time in Australia and elsewhere. Now, these perspectives have become embedded in the official narrative. If we access the Australian government website, we can read the following. The emergence of dot paintings by Indigenous men from the western deserts of Australia in the early 1970s has been called the greatest art movement of the 20th century. This is what the Australian government thinks. Prior to this, most cultural material by Indigenous Australians was collected by anthropologists. Consequently, collections were found in university departments or natural history museums, not art galleries. That all changed at a place called Papunya, and with what became known as the Papunya Tula movement of the Western Desert. Now, this is to say the least rather an oversimplified version of history, which also privileges one stylistic movement over all others. And indeed, it overlooks the fact that early on it was only university departments and ethnographic museums that acquired any of the early Papunya works. So once they became recognised, there's been a tremendous scrabble to try and get the anthropology departments and ethnographic museums to release some of those works. However, someone must be to blame for the length of time that it took Indigenous art to breach the citadels of fine art. Now, one of the main reasons we look for unitary explanations of the past is a sense of moral outrage that it took us so long to get to our present position of enlightenment. According to the American historian at UCLA, Lynn Hunt, presentism provides a distorting lens in which modernity becomes the standard of judgment against which most of the past is found wanting. And further, it masks the actual processes that led to the present. The argument goes, not her argument, but the critical argument, there has to be a reason why people did not recognise the richness of Australian Aboriginal art and the complexity of Aboriginal society in the 18th and 19th centuries. It must have been that museums and the scholars associated with them were complicit in a process that masked the reality that was otherwise completely open for people to see. So what were the factors that meant, for most of Australia's post-colonial history, works by Indigenous artists were excluded from the art galleries? What kept them in the ethnographic and natural history museums? How was Aboriginal art separated off, or perhaps more correctly, for so long not included? One factor, unquestionably, was the simplistic evolutionary model from the 19th century, which survived in the popular imagination long after its rejection in anthropology and in archaeology. Categorization is a fundamental human process. It's also integral to the ways in which human beings are socialized into the world and think about the world. Categories do not exist in isolation, but in relation to other concepts and as members of different kinds of sets. Examples of such sets in the 19th century and early 20th century: savage, barbarian, civilized, another set; magic, religion, science, another set; craft, design, art. Categories can be ordered in sets that reflect deterministic relationships between things, and in the evolutionists' thinking, neither religion nor art were associated with the early stages of the evolution of human society. The progress from barbarism to civilization was also the journey from craft to art, and magic through science to religion. The ethnocentric reference point for art and civilization was 19th century Europe. That was highly contested in the 19th century, but it's the kind of received opinion that people look back on that period of time. Art museums for a long period of time had European art and civilization and its antecedents as the main criteria for the inclusion in the gallery. This perspective on art was current well into the late 20th century, as we can gauge from a letter written by a renowned non-Indigenous Australian artist, Brett Whiteley, to Lloyd Rees, an artist from an earlier generation, but again a renowned Australian artist, just before the latter's death. I know, Lloyd, that I will continue to be influenced by you until the day I too come up to giving in and giving over. And I know someone will pick up something of what I've done and carry the mantle on into the 2000s, whatever shape and form that will take. So the profound thread that leads its way back to Leonardo and on through the millennia to Egypt, that gets that wonderful line, that most precious club in the world that occasionally adds new members and bids farewell to those whose innings of dreamings are done. I mean, I think that innings of dreamings, of course, is a very Australian kind of phrase that somehow captures our obsession with cricket and a sort of reference to Indigenous Australians there somehow in the back. But still, the second factor that concerns the fine art museums as the arbiter of quality, or at least the place where works judged to be of the finest quality from a particular period, movement, or artist can find its place, that factor has been very influential in what is and what can be excluded and included. The art museum is a competitive environment in which objects and curators alike fight for the space for storage and exhibition. Art museums can and do expand their ambit collectively by subcategorization into portrait galleries, contemporary art museums, design museums, Asian art, and so on. The general inclusive fine art gallery, however, has an overarching role and tends to be the reference point for the kinds of works that can be included in the other fine art institutions as fine art. And on the whole in Australia, Aboriginal art in general found it difficult to gain a place. And there's always been a problem with the general category of primitive art, which was one of those areas where people for a long time tried to include and at the same time exclude the arts of much of the world. The competitive nature of the Fine Art Museum and institution, based on qualitative criteria where space and expertise are at a premium, acts as a constraint to the processes of change, even if the heart and spirit are willing. It makes it difficult for new members to enter that precious club. The role of the curators is a crucially important one, and until recently, Aboriginal art was not part of their art history. The movement of Aboriginal art in the gallery required a reworking of the category of art that moved it away from its connections to a particular imagined cultural historical trajectory to become a place for the inclusion of multiple art histories. And it required the development of criteria for inclusion based on expert knowledge of the art that enabled works to be singled out on the basis of criteria of significance that were separate from their relevance to Western art history. So, in a sense, the part of the problem with the category of primitive art was that it made the criteria of relevance to the development of modernism and things like this an important, perhaps the most important criteria for the inclusion of non-Western art. The fact that Aboriginal art was excluded from the fine art museums meant that it was excluded from the art history associated with those institutions. I don't want to exaggerate the conservative of Western fine art galleries. The fine art museums are much more flexible institutions than they sometimes appear or are made out to be. The Fine Art Museum and the Ethnographic Museum have been places of change as well as resistance. Now, for the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to open a few windows on the contested but far from linear process by which Aboriginal art became art in the sense of being included as the kind of object finds a place in an art museum. And I'm going to begin by just actually showing the difficulties that people in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries might have had in moving works of art from Indigenous Australians in a gallery, or even recognising the kinds of things that they were. Because our Western categories of art are themselves always changing. So, rock art, not so easy to move into the gallery, at least in a legitimate way. These extraordinary body paintings at a circumcision ceremony. Here, would this have been recognised as fine art in the 19th, 18th century? These are actually women's skirts from in the Smithsonian Museum from Groot Island, made from stringy bark, beautifully painted with naturally burnishing red ochre with designs that you can see faintly within them. This is a sand sculpture of a stingray. Here you can see the outright body of the stingray, and there's the tail of the stingray going into the distance. Well, today we're used to environmental sculptures of magnitude. This was first recorded at first contact with Yolngu people, which didn't happen until the 1930s. The frontier moved north in Australia in parts much more slowly than people realise, and also in the desert. And this was first recorded by the anthropologist Donald Thompson, who was sent in by the Australian government instead of a punitive expedition. And this has been remade, if you like, conserved for a period of at least 80 years that we know. And it's used in a ceremonial context, in a public ceremonial context, for wishing people good fortune in fishing by putting the remains of yesterday's meals in the eyes of the stingray. Okay, I think most people here would be happy to accept this as a work of art today, but people encountering it in the 19th century, much less likely to. These beautiful baskets. I'm going to go very quickly over this. Here's another, the basketry is a fantastic tradition in Australia, using all sorts of different kinds of materials. This is actually used to transport a narcotic called pitchery for journeys of several, well over 1,000 kilometres from the centre of Australia to the coast. Coffin painting lids. Ceremonial sculptures. We'll come back briefly to this later on, but here is a post that represents multiple things, but it's an ancestral woman travelling across the countryside, but it also represents the trees that she got honey from. It also represents a woman associated with the spirit of that ancestral being who died some 10 years ago, and the painting on it is the painting that is going to be painted on a child undergoing a circumcision ceremony. So, but it's an extraordinarily beautiful object. And Indigenous Australians, the category of minty or design is one that applies both to human creative designs, but also ones created by ancestral beings. And these are a group of ancestral beings called Wandjina on the coast of Western Australia. Here you can see very much like human sculptural figures looking out to sea. Here another image of them lower down. Here there are paintings of Wandjina that are still done today in the Kimberley area of the north of Western Australia. And it will go on, yeah. Yes. Steps to recognition and denial, and we're going to see that painting again because this is the way it was represented by the first European to see it, a man called Gray, who came there and decided that it was far too good to ever have been painted by Indigenous Australians who couldn't possibly produce art, and developed all sorts of theories about it coming from a Mediterranean civilization that came across the sea to Australia, that had a high culture that then became extinct to be replaced by barbarians. And that particular kind of argument is one that is actually reproduced sometimes today. Here is the rock art of Western Arnhem Land, one of the great rock art regions of the world. Here are two paintings collected by Baldwin Spencer, an anthropologist in 1912, who was one of the first people to recognize and write about the richness of Aboriginal art. There have been many moments in which people, artists, anthropologists, others have suddenly said, hold it, this is fantastic. This painting here, collected in 1912, has had a very interesting history. It was in the, and is in the museum in Victoria. It then travelled to America in 1941. This isn't America, you'll be glad to know. This was when it was exhibited in the late 1930s in Australia. And here you can see the way that the artist Percy Leeson, who painted the catalogue illustration, has positioned these people as sort of barbarians, hardly able, one could think, to do any image whatsoever, completely contradicted by the extraordinary complexity of this representation. And then it moved to America. Moved to America thanks to Theodore Seitzer, who was the curator of the Yale Art Museum, and also thanks to World War too, because America and Australia decided that they needed to get closer together, and money was provided for an exhibition of Australian art in America, sponsored by the Museum of Modern Art in the early period. It travelled right the way around America to the Metropolitan Museum, to the field, to the Art Institute in Chicago. And it was supposed to be only non-Indigenous paintings. It was supposed to show Australian art as it was as contemporary art in the world. And Seitzer, having spent 3 months going around Australian galleries, decided if we show this, no one's going to come to see it, because Australian art, he felt, was so far behind what was happening in America at that moment when modernism was beginning to have its impact on American art practice. And so he rescued the exhibition in his mind by going to the National Museum of Victoria and selecting a whole series of paintings collected by Baldwin Spencer. So in 1941, they were exhibited, and there's that image there. This is the New York Times, and here we have the subheading, From the Antipodes to Surrealism. Here we have a Miro, here we have a Salvador Dali. And the reviews, this is not atypical, did indeed pick up on the Australian Aboriginal art, on the whole not on the non-Indigenous art, and it did also pick up some of the more modernist or more contemporary of the non-Indigenous Australian artworks. This is to show them in their glorious colour. And the next image will show the fact that anybody who, this painting is now, the Miro is in the Museum of Modern Art. The New York Times illustrated it upside down. I've illustrated it upside down. Here it is the right way up. Okay, and interestingly, one might imagine that if it had been that way, that whoever was the editor would have selected some relationship between the figure there, the heads looking at each other, and I would have introduced what I was saying by the sensitivity of the person who was writing it. If you read the article, it didn't seem that sensitive, but then on the other hand, the exhibition by Miro was curated by James Sweeney, whose previous exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art had been on African figurative sculpture. So in fact, Sweeney himself at that time was very much engaged in that particular dialogue with Indigenous art, and so one could imagine that he may well have appreciated the Australian paintings that were in the Met then. Another anthropologist, Ronald Berndt, he's unwrapping here paper on brown butcher's a crayon drawing on brown butcher's paper. He thought that collecting these in 1946 was probably the greatest thing he did in his life. They were rolled up in the Berndt Art Museum until shortly before his death, and here he is unwrapping them. They were completely unknown, unrecognized, although Ron used them to illustrate some of his books, because Aboriginal art for a long period of time was not being exhibited much in Australia until the 1970s, with a couple of exceptions. We're going to come across those in a minute. But Ron was a great advocate for Aboriginal art, and he edited a book with a man called Tony Tuxson, who was the Deputy Director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and who in 1959, 58, 59, made a very important move in the journey to the recognition of Aboriginal art. Tony Tuxson was a closet abstract expressionist painter. Today, his paintings are by far the most in demand of Australian abstract expressionism, but nobody really knew he was a painter until almost the last years of his life. But he was persuaded by a surgeon whose passion was collecting Aboriginal art that if Scougall provided the money, Tuxton would make collections and bring them into the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And he did. And these Pukamani poles were the first set to enter the walls. And this painting here by Mawalung, the same person who was drawing for Ron Burnt in crayons in 1946, this bark painting was part of a major collection that entered the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So these were steps towards recognition that was happening, but again with intervals and with delays. So this happened in 1959, 1960. For the next 20 years nearly, other art galleries in Australia were not acquiring works of Aboriginal art, and indeed there was some discussion in the Art Gallery in New South Wales, maybe they'd better move them back to the Australian Museum. Fortunately they didn't, fortunately for them, fortunately in lots of ways. Then I'm just going to show a really brief encounter that I've had in my life as an anthropologist, in that I did my master's thesis at University College London in the 1970s. I was a research assistant at the British Museum, and I wrote a theoretical master's thesis. My supervisor said, "What's all this theory? You've got to analyse some objects." So I went to the library and I found this extraordinary issue of the records of the South Australian Museum, which had some 400 images of these beautiful little objects. I'm not going to be able to go into them in any detail. I've written quite a lot about them. You'll see, rather lovely. No one had written about these between 1919 and when I did my thesis in 1973. They were exhibited in the South Australian Museum. They're quite exquisite. I was studying how they communicated meaning. They were put in the ground to tell people where they had gone, where they'd moved to from one camp to another. Then, in the 1986, they appeared with a very different kind of cover in the South Australian Museum. They'd been discovered by two anthropologists, Peter Sutton, Chris Anderson, and a historian, Philip Jones. And they decided to make an intervention in the Adelaide Art Festival. And so they curated this exhibition called Art and Land, which was extremely controversial and had lots of people saying, "What on earth are you presenting them in this kind of way? You know, these are old direction signs. Oh, they're not art, they weren't made for art," and so on. But at the same time, visually, they had an incredible impact. And they presented them in a very different way. They used the kind of techniques for representing objects in a Western context as art. Lighting is very important, attention to detail, attention to texture, developing formal analogues. And here you can see, you know, people are suddenly saying, "Gosh, you know, if you look at them, aren't they wonderful?" These are incredible visual puns, but I can't go into them. So my master's thesis at University College London was actually exhibited in the exhibition, in a way. So I was indirectly part of a kind of process where things were changing. My agency had nothing to do with this particular exhibition, though I was in sympathy, obviously, with what was happening. And that same set of people were involved in another really groundbreaking exhibition in 1988 called Dreamings, the Art of Aboriginal in Australia, held in the Asian Society here in New York. And many of the leading collectors of Aboriginal art in America and Europe started collecting as a result of seeing this exhibition. So exhibitions in these kinds of contexts are fundamentally important parts of a value creation process. It's not that nobody had recognised the value of Australian Aboriginal art for the 200 years since colonisation at all. One or two people had. Artists, anthropologists, quite a lot of missionaries, people who were often subsequently pigeonholed as the piece and who hadn't seen the value here. I'm going to now quickly move on to looking at Yolngu art from a Yolngu context, but also looking outside. Yolngu have always been engaged in this process of persuasion with outsiders of the value of their way of life, but also of the value of their cultural production. They've actually never had a problem with their art being exhibited in art galleries. For a long time, just about everybody else did. And there was a sense in which anthropologists in the 1940s, 50s, many of them were uncomfortable with the idea of putting material culture works in art museums. They said, well, you're taking it away from its context, you're denying its meaning, its significance. There were obviously exceptions through the history of anthropology. Baldwin Spencer was one, Ron Burt was another, Franz Boas here in New York was another. So there were people who didn't have that particular perception. And often the people, the indigenous communities that they were working with, I suspect that in many cases were really very positive at that moment in time, that the works that they were producing that people were interested in were hopefully going to go in context away and actually celebrate their work, and in the hope as part of the ways of stopping the colonial attitude of negativity towards them. And Yolngu certainly really had that in mind from the initial exchanges with missionaries. And they were particularly lucky because they were colonized after it became impossible to massacre Aboriginal people. As I said, Donald Thompson arrived there instead of a punitive expedition, and by missionaries who believed that Christianity had to come from within, and you couldn't introduce Christianity by insisting that people threw away their existing beliefs and religious practices and so on. So the Methodist Church, if you were going to be colonised by any missionaries, then being colonised by the Methodists in Northeast Ireland was probably a good thing. Here is a body painting. Yolngu still produce exactly the same kinds of paintings or there are the same kind of context for paintings in Yolngu society today as there were 60 years ago. So this is something from a film that I've made of a Yolngu circumcision ceremony. Here you can see the use of a brush of human hair to create this cross-hatching, this shimmering, brilliant surface called biryun in Yolngu language. Here is a bark painting made for sale to the outside world. This bark painting itself, though, is one that the artist himself is not only a meaningful design, it's one that in painting that he's reflecting also on his present kind of context. The addition here of a black line within the cross-hatching was his uncertainty about the impact that alcohol was going to have on his children and his grandchildren as a result of them failing to get the license removed from the pub that was the bar that was being opened at the neighbouring mining town. And so he said that this is showing the disruption potentially in this ancestral path. But it was a painting made for the outside, but of enormous value on the inside. Exhibition. Well, these are boys who have just been painted for their circumcision, following, in fact, their circumcision, and they're standing up for a kind of official post-circumcision photograph. So you can see these beautiful paintings, different designs reflecting the different clans that people are coming from. Another exhibition. These are all relatively unelaborated geometric designs, which are seen to be the ancestral designs associated with particular spirit places where human conception spirits come from, but where the spirit of the dead return. And they're coming out of a ceremonial ground into a public space. So exhibition is a component very much of Yolngu cultural practice. And sorry, some of these images are a little large, so here we are. Here is a sand sculpture used in a mortuary ritual. This is a smaller scale sand sculpture than the enormous one that we've seen. It's one that's made after the burial of a person whose body was held in that shade there. It's produced for purification ceremonies, but it's an integral part of the performance that's going on. I'm just going to show a couple of images that show the way that Yolngu cultural practice is then transformed into paintings that enter the world art markets. This is a painting, a small painting of the origin of this particular sand sculpture. It was made by an ancestral woman after she'd had a feast of parrotfish. These are two parrotfish. They're actually dead parrotfish that are now being consumed. The fish remains by maggots and things like that, because after this ancestral woman ate the fish, she would then put what was left over in a little scooped ellipse in the sand beside her. That scooped ellipse is then that particular sand sculpture in elliptical form. And within that sand sculpture, people will come after the ceremony to be smoked for purification, will be washed, and there will be dances that remove the body of that sand sculpture. I could talk about that for many, many hours. This is the fish, which is consumed partly by maggots, but also these are thousands of little soldier crabs that come across the sand when the tide is out and get rid of the remains of fish. Here you can see that elliptical form of the sand sculpture. Here is the body of a person who has passed away. What happens after death is that the spirit rises to one dimension to the Milky Way. The pattern on the back actually represents the Milky Way at night. So you have this little condensed image that, if we looked in the previous one, was the same shape as the fish being transformed after death. This is the human spirit in its transformation. And in the middle here, same artist, same painting, but good heavens, what era of contemporary art does that come from? But this is by a Yolngu artist, showing in a way the diversity. This is the same artist producing those two images. This is his daughter producing that image. That particular painting there is one that is produced, although on a Yolngu theme, for outside contexts. And here, just showing this post-hollow log sand sculpture, in a sand sculpture at a ceremony at Yilpra, and here in the British Museum at the exhibition that I was involved in curating last year. And deliberately, the artist in this case, who is the son of the person who that previous painting in the ceremony, decided that it would be good to show people the trees that these hollow logs came from, with knobs and all, and so that was part of his sort of conception, showing the transformation of the trees into artworks there. Okay. Goinbis Boiko. Boiko is the name of this place that the painting comes from. Well, it's going to the Metropolitan Museum. It's in the collection now of the Metropolitan Museum. It's a gift from the Levy Kaplans, who have built a large collection for the Seattle Art Museum, and it's one of 8 paintings that's being transferred, and I think has already been transferred to the Metropolitan Museum. It's actually not on bark. Goinby does many works on bark, but on this particular, he's very innovative, and in his earlier life he worked in Northeast Arnhem Land as a builder in homeland centres, so he's very good at using leftover materials from house construction, and this is something that's a roof ceiling kind of thing that's been carved and painted. Okay, I'm going to show you where this painting comes from and a little bit about how its design, in a sense, where its design comes from. It's a painting associated with this river that we can see here, and there are 2 places that I'm going to look at which have paintings by Goinby. This is the river mouth at a place called Baralcha, and the river flows from a place called Gangan inland, which we'll see is up there on the ceiling, and in the wet season this whole area here is flooded. It's a place where you have a monsoon season and a dry season. At the end of the dry season, the river has almost disappeared. It's a chain of waterholes. And the salt from the sea, Yolngu Sea, has moved up the river. You can taste the salt inland. And the salt is carried inland by an ancestral snake who created the river. And the ancestral snake, its main home is here, but it also travels inland. So at the end of the dry season, people are waiting for this snake to suddenly rise up, flicking its tongue, thunder and lightning, the clouds of the monsoon come, torrential rain comes, and this is the snake. We can see it here. This is a bark painting collected by the anthropologist Donald Thompson, who was sent in instead of a punitive expedition. The bark paintings are now in the Museum Victoria. This great snake, at the end of the wet season, what happens is, of course, the fish are abundant. They're abundant in the landscape, and they flow down into the river mouth. And when it's then back almost to its normal shape at the beginning of the dry season, the ancestral snake invented a fish trap. These are the ribs of the ancestral snake going across the river, and the ancestral snake also then put some leaves from mangroves and so on and so forth, and used it to hold back the water and trap vast quantities of fish that were then eaten in ceremonial meals, celebrating the spiritual power of this ancestral snake. So this is a bark painting of that place. That bark painting, well, that's the same painting, slight variant on it, produced 4 or 5 years ago at a circumcision ceremony. You can see here the snake standing up, and there's its flickering tongue going out, bringing thunder and lightning. So this is a theme of lots of Yolngu paintings. this is the snake. Its bloated body is the wet season. And there's the river mouth. There's the snake's ribs going across it. That's the fish trap. There it is going out to sea. This is the snake standing up. There's its flickering tongue done in a different way by a different artist. This is that place in Barato. This is the artist, Goinby, whose painting's in the museum. This is the snake. That's its tongue flickering. This is its center of power. Looking out at the bottom, that's out to sea, where you're seeing on the ripples of the water moving in the effect of the lightning flickering at the night in the water. Okay, so you're now beginning to see the similarities between these paintings in this place. We're going to move, I'm nearly at the end of the talk, we're going to move from here, that's the river, up here where the painting in the Met comes from. And it will come. This is the place, inland waterhole in Gangan, taken during the dry season. And here we are. That's one of the crayon drawings collected by Ron Burnt of this place, and you can see this diamond design. Here you can see particular ways in which long-necked freshwater turtles are represented. Don't worry too much about the content of this. As I say, each of these paintings I could talk to you for hours about, so I'm not going to. We'll move on to the next. Okay, this is a painting by Goinby's grandfather. Same waterhole. You can see the same background clan design here. Here you can see the figurative representations of the ancestral beings who came out of the water at this particular place and who, if you like, transferred a lot of the knowledge and the spiritual power to the clans in surrounding areas. This is a painting in the National Museum of Australia. Let's move on. Actually, before we're moving on, you can see he's represented these ancestral beings, and the same kind of paintings that you saw on the chests of people in circumcision ceremonies or coming out of the ceremonial ground are the paintings that you can see on the bodies of the ancestral beings. So in ceremonial performances, people are making themselves, they're making the initiates into representations of the ancestral beings coming from place. And these patterns that you see here are seen to be both the surface, the skin of the ancestral beings, but the meaning of those designs, the word for them is ngaraka, which is the bone, the backbone. So these designs very much embody the ancestral beings in place. Now, it'll probably move on now. It does. This is a painting that I collected that's in the National Museum of Australia. Okay, the place that has a different kind of fish trap. A fish trap made of paper bark, woven paper bark, that is put across the river. And there's a dam, and the paper bark, like a mat almost, is on the top of it. And what happens is that the fish, trying to go downstream as the floodwaters are receding, leap up and they get caught on the paper bark mat. And so people come along, pick up these fish. Yolngu have incredible traps in different rivers. This is the time for the ceremonial feast in celebration of the power of the ancestral beings in this place. So this is the fish trap that is in fact in Goinby's painting, but it's the ancestral fish trap that has the spirit of the ancestral beings who first of all created it. The reason they're in the form there of freshwater long-necked tortoises is all of these ancestral beings are transformational in shape, and this is them in human form, This is them in one of their animal sort of manifestations. These paintings here are of that fish trap. This is a painting by a woman called Jirira, who is the daughter of Yangarin, who did this painting. And you see the sort of movement towards abstraction in a painting produced for sale, which ironically corresponds to the abstraction that Yolngu produced in their sacred art. And here is her painting of the, if you like, the sort of ancestral vortex associated with that place. And here are the fish, Beipinger, a particular kind of fish that is the one caught on that particular fish trap. But it's also the place where the fertility of the fish emanates from, and the fish in turn in Yolngu thought, if you like, the embryos, the spirit embryos for the human beings who succeeded the ancestral beings in place. So if you sort of add these two paintings together, you can see this little geometric diamond design which we've seen throughout. Here you can see this circular form which in Yolngu terms the center of ancestral power is the word for it is Mingochi, the eye of the ancestral being, and it's the flash of the light of the ancestral being in the water hole. So you here have paintings that are capturing the spiritual power in place. And here are two paintings of Goinbis, one you've seen already, the ancestral being, and you can see what's happened in this painting here. This is just the movement of that central place, which is the water hole, the foundation place of spiritual power. Here, this, believe it or not, is a piece of insulating material from between the ceiling and the roof of the house that he was making. And he's cut through the design using a Yolngu technique of using today a sort of sharp razor blade that then brings the contrast between the silver of the insulation material and the background, and then he's painted cross-hatching over it. But it's certainly something that you can imagine emanates ancestral power. And this is the paintings in the Met. So you see, it's almost as though Jirira's paintings have kind of been put together. You can see the pattern here, which is the mat stretching across the water hole, but it's not an ordinary mat, it's not an ordinary water hole. This is this place at Gangang, the place where spiritual power emanates. Going to be as an exquisite craftsman, as well as having an extraordinary kind of artistic imagination in different kinds of areas. And I think it's quite wonderful that this painting is ending up in the Met. People writing about it in blogs say the Met would have never have bought it if it was on bark. I don't believe that anymore. And they also say the Met would not be remotely interested in the kind of narrative that I've been talking about. I don't believe that anymore, because this, in a sense, is Yolngu art history. It's the art history that must, in cultural institutions, be associated with artworks, whether they were produced yesterday or 1,000 years ago. So I'll finish at this point. Thank you.
The floor is now open for questions.
May I ask the scale of the piece that's in the Met?
It's reasonable size. It's like sort of probably stretches across from here to about where you are. So it's quite a large work.
Thank you.
Which department of the Met? This comes back to your original theme about these
I
tensions.
think. Does anyone know? I've got a.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Oceania collection
Yes.
at the minute. And,
Yeah.
So it's not part of contemporary art.
this gift is coming in as a collaboration between the arts of Oceania, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, and modern and contemporary.
Yeah.
So it is the first step in the collaboration.
But where are you exhibiting it?
We will do a show of these works. I was out meeting today actually with colleagues in modern and contemporary, and that's going to happen in September. So it will be in the modern and contemporary. Yeah, but we are moving into this new era, this new phase where we collaborate with our colleagues in modern and contemporary. So, I mean, one of the reasons it's come into the modern and contemporary collection is that it's two-dimensional. They are two-dimensional works, and so for practical reasons and for storage, they need to go into their collection. But then they acknowledge that this is a kind of new area for them. So they want to, they want to be open to collaborate, to kind of working through. So it's really exciting because we are now kind of able to expand these modalities. And he is the only male artist out of the 8, so there are 7 works by women.
Yes.
And when this one came into the museum, because of course it was exhibited along with the Napangadi at Harvard Art Museum, that was curated by Stephen Gilchrist last year. So it's been on the East Coast, so that it came down earlier than the other 6, which haven't arrived yet. And that was a great conversation with modern contemporary curators and myself and their collections management and conservation, because of course this, people had not really seen incised laminate boards. They were asking what's this and flipping it over, and there's a lot of detail in the back, so it was really great to have them kind of acknowledge the craftsmanship.
And you see, this is happening really quite slowly, even in the Australian country. I actually, at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, some 20 years ago, organised an exhibition of contemporary Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australian art that had a whole series of people who are now kind of household names in both areas. And an exhibition like that had not been held in Australia. And it's quite interesting how a lot of these kind of changes can happen outside Australia and then go back. So in the case of the National Gallery of Victoria and even the National Gallery in Canberra, it is actually quite rare still to have exhibitions that cross-cut the curatorial, let's think of a polite word, areas of expertise, we'll say, but they're now recognising that this is crazy, and so you're having really big sort of change. But you have lots of problems associated with that, because if they've been curated separately, then you have different curatorial traditions, different art histories, and then suddenly you've got to say, it's like anything that is cross-cutting those kind of categories. And I think that's one of the really good things about the inclusion, increasingly, of Indigenous art in fine art museums, is that it challenges received categories that then move over to other sort of areas.
It was one of the points you make about this difference between art museums and ethnographic museums. It's often as much about the kind of making of those collections. And ethnographic museums have often been, collections are made through the result of anthropological field expeditions, etc. And so, when you kind of think about how an art museum and then this museum in the States and how that's made, the Met is actually really like lots of museums within a museum. And so, in a way, our department, which was the Museum of Primitive Art, which had this very strong historical link with the Museum of Modern Art, and that collection coming up to the Metropolitan in 1981 and the new wing being built for it. We do something different in the big museum, and so we've always, in a sense, and I've only been there 2 years, but this the kind of pushing out of those parameters. We're a kind of agile space really in the museum where we can kind of push our elbows out a bit and force collaborative, because we collaborate in a sense with photography, with the photographs department and other places in the museum, because we want to be representative of the regions we look after, but we're not going to limit ourselves to certain media. So
I want to jump in with two questions. One about the very last thing you said, and the second about the very first thing you said. Starting with the last thing.
Yeah.
So you said this is Yolngu art history. This is the story that has to travel with the art. And so my first question is, how important has it been historically and into the present for the artists that these ancestral connections travel with the paintings? And what means have they used to encourage the traveling of the story with the paintings? And the second related question has to do with the first thing you said, which is framing this as a journey to recognition in the cathedrals of Western art. You made a very compelling case about the successful reclassification, let's say, of this material as fine art in sort of Western art museums. How would one make the argument that these, at the same time, are the material culture of recognition as a political process over this period of time? Where are the moments where the recognition of this stuff as art has either reflected or encouraged the recognition of Aboriginal people in a political context?
I mean, let's answer the second question first. In the case of Yolngu, they are very, very explicit that the meaning must go with the art. The market and a particular ideological position until relatively recently has gone against this, and a lot of Indigenous Australians in certain contexts, not the art producers, will say, we don't want to have anything to do with the meaning of this art because it's ceremonial, restricted, and so on. You shouldn't know anything about it. It's secret. There's been a whole section of the art market which has said a similar kind of thing. No point in telling you what this is about. The story's secret. They don't want you to know about it, but just appreciate it for what it is. And it fitted in with an ideology that art should be seen and experienced in its own right without any contextualizing information, which makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, there's an Indigenous Australian intellectual, Marcia Langton, who said this is insane because any European visitor at a European art exhibition who actually knows anything about art will come with a whole baggage that can assist in that kind of interpretation. And so there's no contradiction between being able to appreciate art aesthetically and sort of, then knowing something else. And so Jambo Marawili, who is an older artist who's greatly influenced Goinby in several ways. At the Biennale in Sydney, his artist statement says, I want people to know these are not just pretty things. They have a great deal of story with them. So Yolngu have wanted people to know that. And that really connects back to how people have used it and the fact that they've used it in political action from the very beginning, and in that they were using it to teach the missionaries about Yolngu religious beliefs and so on. And in a very short period of time, the 20 or so years after the mission, the Methodist Church at Yirrkala and Millingimby incorporated Aboriginal artworks, not Aboriginal Christian artworks, but Yolngu artworks, side by side with Christian iconography. So they were persuading the missionaries, and then of course there was a bark petition that was sent to Parliament. So it's been a very, very important thing, and I think that you did need to overturn this kind of attitude that came in that Aboriginal people didn't have religion, didn't have art, they belonged to us, and that was a real dead weight for a long period of time, and you still can see that coming up, and you'll find sort of shock jocks on the radio will say, "Oh, my children could do this." But I mean, of course, they say that about a lot of contemporary non-Indigenous artists as well. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wondered if you could go back to this question you raised about
Yeah.
why all of these non-experts have to be hustled out of the story, right, as these things are
Yeah.
transitioning between different kinds of institutions. And part of that you answered that there's a kind of evolutionary and colonial baggage that
Yeah.
precedes
Yeah.
much of this. But I wondered if you might reflect a little bit about your own position as an anthropologist moving through these worlds, and how you position yourself in relation to connoisseurship and other sorts of expectations that are now being placed on you. It's a bit personal, I apologize.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I don't have at all a problem with connoisseurship as long as it's based on being relatively open to change one's position as one gets more knowledge and experience and as one talks to other kinds of people. So I think that I have no doubt that Yolngu themselves recognize the difference in the qualitative aspects of different artists' production, and people will really hope that they can persuade someone to paint their son in a circumcision ceremony. So the application of qualitative criteria is there, and it's there in all aspects of Yolngu kind of cultural and ceremonial performance. When it comes to singing, when it comes to dancing, Yolngu are archetypal kind of Shekner kind of theorists almost, in that rehearsal is part of performance, and they'll sit there and they'll encourage, and they'll reach a sort of point where they'll actually say, "You've done it, that's great," kind of thing, and at the same time, "You've done it, that's great," you feel this sense of spiritual uplift or something like that. So you'll have to, but it doesn't contradict the fact that people are recognizing those kind of things. So I don't worry about connoisseur. In fact, the exact opposite. I think that you need and one of the real problems with exhibitions of Aboriginal art that have been overseas and elsewhere that have not had that kind of expertise is that they have not exhibited often works that I would consider are ones that are finest and should be in those kind of spaces. And as far as the anthropological art, I just see that as kind of the equivalent of art historical knowledge. I really don't see that kind of, and I think one should be in dialogue with art history. I think most anthropologists, not present company here, have not been very good at analysing form, and have, as far as their appreciation of art concerned, been very much, like the average Australian or American or something like that. They have their own tastes, and they have not,
I guess I was going to ask questions that pick up on the same themes, which is, could you tell us a little bit more about how Australian anthropologists in general are reacting? And I know there's great diversity, but in the museum going public in Australia, where do they situate themselves with these things? I'm sure there's a diversity, but if there's any trends.
Look, I mean, Aaron and I would both say, I think, I'll see if he contradicts me, that anthropologists neglected art appallingly as they neglected material culture for a period of about 60, 70, 80 years after around about the First World War, that kind of time, partly because material culture art were associated with evolutionary theory. Then there's kind of reason. So there were always one or two anthropologists who were really, really engaged with art, but majority were not. And I think that, to me, there's not a problem with that. Why on earth should anthropologists be particularly interested in art as art. But if they neglect it as a source of understanding the material sort of dimension of people's lives, then it is a problem. It's a huge problem in the area of archaeology. Archaeologists have been utterly interested in rock art on the whole. People who have been studying the European Upper Paleolithic, only occasionally are they, and yet this is one of the greatest resources you could possibly have. So it is rather strange the way that art is something that in academic life, in quite a lot of disciplines, has been sort of seen something that's sort of outside. Art is art schools, but there's been a sort of disconnect between art history and art practice very often as well. So yeah, it's a good question. People are changing. I think. Do you get a sense that people are more interested in art and material culture now, anthropologists?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier today. I think that in some ways the kind of post-colonial self-critique of the ethnographic museum over the last 30 years has been ahead of the curve in the field in some ways, in engaging directly with this material, sometimes by reframing it as art within the ethnographic museum, sometimes as pushing back against art, but mostly in sort of dealing with the collections and communities. And it's been, I think it's been a real locus of the kind of revitalization, not only of the anthropology of art, but within the field, for arguing the relevance and other ways of thinking about the relevance of these collections in the present.
Yeah, and Australian anthropologists who work with Indigenous Australians are much more likely to be interested in art and music and than those who are working elsewhere in the world these days. Yeah.
How much of the running in all this is made by the trade and private collectors rather than just museums on their own?
Those things work hand in hand. Almost every question you have enters so many different sort of domains, because on the whole, galleries have had sort of very limited budgets. Art galleries have had relatively limited budgets over time. So when it's suggested that they should buy and start developing a new area, they say, you can't possibly sort of move into that kind of area. So it leaves open the space for private collectors who actually do, in a sense, have a resource to build collections. And I suspect this has happened in many areas of art, that they have actually started to collect in those particular kinds of areas and build collections. And those collections then become an important resource, together with the resource that's in the ethnographic museums, when that recognition process comes. And they work hand in hand, in a sense, with that recognition process, because their collectors are part of a public. They're part of a public that is suddenly seeing value in these material objects. And so there is then a generation of interest, and other people look at it. So I think you can't separate those kinds of things off.
So when you refer to art gallerists, are you referring to commercial gallerists? Yes.
Yeah.
Not museum curators?
No. And I think they've had they do have a really important role. I think the point that you were making about the connection with contemporary art and Indigenous art, you find that a lot of the people who were the dealers in Indigenous art, even when they were calling it primitive art, which we don't want to call it anymore, were also the people who were really interested in contemporary art. So they were part of a kind of dialogue that was influencing a community that was ahead, in some ways, of the curatorial past of the art institutions, in some ways.
And yet also responsible for that. It doesn't matter what it means.
Yeah.
Discourse, right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of like it's optical pleasure or complexity is another. Sorry.
It's a practice as an add-on. The institutional landscape of Australia is really complex. You know, I just wanted to get a real hold on that in the last few years. You know, because you have art galleries of New South Wales where those poles are on display collections. You know, with three-dimensional works, and then you know, you have the modern contemporary art galleries, then you have the dealers and the kind of gallerists, and then you have the museums. And so it strikes me that every major conurbation has, you know, the art gallery and the ethnography museum and the art trade. So it's a really complicated. They're all showing the same works, but you're kind of shifting in and out of these frames all the time. So it's fascinating.
I think we have time for one last question.
Just a quick question. I don't know if you'd agree, but I think one of the things that the anthropological approach maybe does that the art historical approach doesn't do is that it explains a little bit what these species do and what they achieve rather than what they mean. So just going back a little bit to Aaron's question, I wonder, can you say something about what you say that these artists have gained recognition. How does it translate into like in the everyday life? And the Yolngu community is a community, not so much as individual artists, but what do they have now that maybe they didn't have 30 years ago, 40 years ago when there was no such recognition?
Right. Look, I mean, that is such a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think that, you could quite strongly say that they have land rights, and if there hadn't have been something like the Bark petition and the paintings in the culture, I think that space for the recognition of land rights in Australia meaningfully was not a very broad one, and I think that kind of intervention was important. In the case of the latest claim that Francis and I have been involved in, which was the Blue Mud Bay Sea claim, it started off with an art exhibition and gained a great deal of sort of collaboration. It started off with an art exhibition by the Art Centre, but because Yolngu art is quite renowned, it meant that it was able to be exhibited in galleries all the way across Australia. And then the National Maritime Museum became really interested in this and bought it. So you had a national institution buying this set of something like 50 Bark paintings all the way along the coast because they were afraid of the intrusion into their land of crabbers and barramundi fisher persons. And there was an ambiguity as to who owned the intertidal zone. And indeed, the government and the Northern Territory and the fishermen thought that when the tide was out, which way round? When it was covered with water. That's right. When the tide was in, they didn't own it, and that was the government position. They thought that the land rights legislation meant that it was only when the tide was out did they own the land. It was crazy. Well, we all thought it was crazy, but that was the established kind of position. So they had to hold a court case to demonstrate this, and it was a huge advantage in that area that they got all the sort of, if you like, the sort of case material together through producing these sets of paintings. And although the court wouldn't have said it was influenced by it, subjectively, the very fact that it was in people's minds. And then what did Yolngu do with the proceeds? These are pretty poor, impoverished communities, but they'd begun to develop a knowledge centre where they've got a kind of media lab and where young people are very involved with filmmaking and things like that. They were able to actually use all of the funds from the sale to the National Maritime Museum to build the physical structure that they wanted for the Knowledge Centre. So it feeds back in all sorts of different kinds of ways. Aboriginal communities in remote Australia are hugely disadvantaged. because government is still oriented towards a model whereby, all people should do is, get proper, education and go and move into a town. They're not going to do that. It's a crazy kind of philosophy that never works, but it does mean that every so often government will suddenly say, Goidby had to stop being a house builder because they weren't building any houses anymore because the government said you shouldn't be living in these remote places. That's a slight oversimplification, but it's in a way it's true. So he creates a different kind of occupation through his skills that he can have in place, and there are very, very few other sort of resources, and Yolngu are exploited by government. Everything else went. So when Obama came to visit in those great days, Australia, they said, we have to get a Yolngu dance group to come out here for him, and so on. So it's part of that thing. So converting that into a recognition of the importance, the depth of culture is very important, and it's changing attitude to art in general. For heaven's sake, when the Australian government decides to cut back funding, they say, we don't need to give money to artists, do we? That's not sort of a real work or anything like that. It's insane. We all see that. But, so yeah, it's been very important. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Everybody join me, please, in thanking Howard. Encourage you to stick around with a glass of wine and some more casual conversation.